The date was September 1st, 1521. 6 Portuguese trading ships set anchored off the coast of southern China, their holds filled with spices, silk, and silver from months of profitable trading. On deck, 600 Portuguese sailors and soldiers cleaned their weapons and prepared for what should have been a routine departure. Then someone spotted the horizon. War junks, hundreds of them. The entire Ming Dynasty naval fleet was bearing down on their position. Thousands of Chinese marines armed with crossbows, fire lances, and righteous fury. The Portuguese captain, Martim Afonso de Melo, did the math. 6 ships against what looked like the entire Chinese navy. Maybe 100-to-1 odds in terms of hulls. Far worse in terms of manpower. Every diplomatic option had failed. Retreat was impossible with the wind against them and Chinese ships blocking escape routes. De Mello gave an order that would determine whether Portugal's expansion into Asia ended here in Chinese waters or continued to reshape global trade. Prepare for battle. Over the next 6 hours, those 600 Portuguese would face the full might of the Ming Dynasty's navy in a clash that would demonstrate, for the first time in history, exactly how European gunpowder weapons could devastate traditional Asian naval forces. What happened at Tamao wasn't just a naval battle. It was the moment European military technology announced its dominance over Asian warfare and changed the balance of power in the Indian Ocean forever. To understand why this battle seemed so hopelessly one-sided, you need to grasp exactly what the Portuguese were facing and why the Ming Dynasty wanted them dead. By 1521, the Ming Dynasty had ruled China for over 150 years, presiding over the world's largest economy, most populous empire, and one of its most sophisticated civilizations. China didn't need the outside world. They had everything they required within their own borders: silk, porcelain, tea, rice, technology, and the administrative expertise to govern hundreds of millions of people. For centuries, the Chinese worldview placed their empire at the center of civilization, with all other nations as tributaries who came to pay respect and offer gifts in exchange for the privilege of trading with the Middle Kingdom. Then the Portuguese arrived. These weren't respectful tributary envoys following diplomatic protocols. They were armed merchants who sailed wherever they wanted, traded with whoever paid best, and showed absolutely no deference to Chinese authority. Worse, they'd established themselves on Chinese-controlled territory without permission, building fortified trading posts along the coast. To Ming officials, this was intolerable arrogance from barbarian foreigners who didn't understand their place in the natural order. But the Portuguese presence represented something more threatening than just cultural insult. They were disrupting the tributary system that maintained Chinese dominance over Asian trade. Local merchants were bypassing official Chinese channels to trade directly with these foreigners who paid better prices and asked fewer questions. Pirates were using Portuguese weapons to become more dangerous. And most alarming, these Europeans possessed military technology that Chinese observers found deeply concerning. Here's what made the Ming response to Portuguese presence so overwhelming. The Chinese Navy in 1521 was massive, well-organized, and backed by the resources of the world's largest empire. War junks that could carry hundreds of soldiers. Fire ships designed to set enemy vessels ablaze. Trebuchets that could hurl explosives. And most importantly, numerical superiority so absolute that they could afford to lose ships and still overwhelm any opponent through sheer numbers. The fleet assembling to attack the Portuguese at Tamao represented the Ming Dynasty's determination to end European presence in Chinese waters permanently and decisively. They weren't planning to negotiate or issue warnings. They were planning to annihilate every Portuguese ship and execute every survivor as a message to any other Europeans considering trade in Asian waters. The Portuguese East Indies operation represented something revolutionary in naval warfare and global economics. Unlike traditional European merchant fleets that stayed close to home waters, the Portuguese had developed the Carrera de India, a trading network stretching from Lisbon to Goa, Malacca, and now the Chinese coast. They achieved this impossible expansion through a combination of factors that made Portuguese ships unique in world maritime history. First, their vessels were purpose-built for both commerce and combat. The carracks and smaller caravels used for Asian trade weren't just merchant ships with a few weapons bolted on. They were floating fortresses designed to fight their way through hostile waters, carry enough cargo to make voyages profitable, and survive storms that would sink traditional Asian vessels. Second, and most crucially, Portuguese ships carried something that would revolutionize naval warfare across the world: heavy bronze cannons. Not the light anti-personnel weapons that Asian navies used, but genuine ship-killing artillery that could punch holes in enemy hulls from ranges where traditional weapons couldn't respond. European cannon technology in 1521 had reached a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched by Asian powers for decades. Portuguese foundries could cast bronze cannons that were relatively light, durable enough for sea voyages, and powerful enough to shatter wooden ships with a few well-placed shots. They developed gun carriages that allowed for aimed fire and reloading at sea. Most importantly, Portuguese crews had trained extensively in naval gunnery, turning cannon operation into a professional skill rather than a novelty weapon. But it wasn't just the cannons that made Portuguese ships so formidable. The crews themselves represented a unique military culture. These weren't impressed sailors forced into service. They were professional maritime warriors who'd spent years fighting their way across 3 oceans. They'd battled Ottoman galleys in the Mediterranean, North African pirates off the Barbary coast, Arab dhows in the Indian Ocean, and rival European fleets competing for the same trade routes. By the time Portuguese ships reached Chinese waters, their crews had more combat experience than almost any naval force in the world. Every man aboard knew how to fight, how to handle weapons in the chaos of naval combat, and most importantly, how to coordinate cannon fire to maximize destructive effect. Here's what made the Portuguese situation at Tamao so desperate despite their technological advantages. They were anchored in a bay with limited maneuvering room, winds were unfavorable for a quick escape, and they were facing a Chinese fleet that probably numbered over 100 war junks. Even with superior weapons, 6 ships couldn't possibly fight that many enemies simultaneously. Portuguese advantages in cannon range and firepower meant nothing if Chinese ships could surround them, board them, and overwhelm their crews through sheer numbers. The Ming strategy was simple and should have been effective. Send wave after wave of war junks to absorb Portuguese cannon fire while closing to boarding range. Once they got close enough, Chinese numerical superiority would become decisive. A few hundred Portuguese couldn't possibly repel thousands of Chinese Marines boarding from all sides simultaneously. Martim Afonso de Melo, commanding the Portuguese fleet, understood the tactical problem perfectly. Standing still meant being surrounded and overwhelmed. Running meant turning their vulnerable sterns to Chinese ships and being picked apart during escape. The only option was to do something no sane commander would attempt when outnumbered this badly: attack. Not a desperate charge, but a calculated aggressive defense designed to destroy Chinese morale before Chinese numbers could become decisive. De Mello had one advantage the Chinese commanders probably didn't fully appreciate. He'd been fighting naval battles in Asian waters for years. He'd seen how traditional Asian tactics emphasized boarding actions and close-quarters combat. He'd observed how Asian naval forces, despite their size and courage, lacked experience defending against sustained artillery bombardment. Most importantly, he'd learned that Asian commanders often became paralyzed when facing tactics they'd never encountered before. The Portuguese crews prepared their ships with grim efficiency. Every cannon was loaded, double shot with both solid balls and grape shot for devastating effect at close range. Spare ammunition was positioned for rapid reloading. Soldiers armed with arquebus, early Portuguese firearms, took positions along the railings. Fire parties prepared buckets and wet blankets to combat the fire ships they knew were coming. Most critically, De Mello positioned his 6 ships in a defensive formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire. Any Chinese junk trying to close with one Portuguese vessel would face cannon fire from multiple ships simultaneously. It was a formation that required precise coordination and absolute trust between ships. If any Portuguese captain broke formation or fled, the entire defensive line would collapse, and they'd be destroyed piecemeal. As the Chinese fleet approached Tamao on September 1st, their commanders were confident. They'd brought overwhelming force against a handful of foreign ships trapped in a bay. They had fire ships to burn Portuguese vessels, war junks to board them, and thousands of Marines to kill every survivor. The barbarian foreigners had nowhere to run. This wouldn't even be a difficult battle, just a systematic destruction of ships that had dared to challenge Chinese authority. What the Ming commanders didn't know was that they were about to encounter naval warfare unlike anything in Chinese military history. They were bringing medieval Asian naval tactics to a fight against early modern European firepower. And over the next 6 hours, the Chinese Navy would learn a lesson that would echo through Asian military thinking for decades. Technology and training could overcome numbers that seemed absolutely insurmountable. The Chinese fleet began its approach in the mid-morning of September 1st, war junks spreading across the bay in a formation designed to surround the Portuguese ships completely. The lead vessels were fire ships, expendable junks loaded with combustibles and crewed by skeleton teams whose job was to get close enough to set Portuguese vessels ablaze before abandoning ship. Behind them came the war junks proper, hundreds of vessels carrying crossbowmen, soldiers with fire lances, and Marines armed with swords and boarding pikes. The Chinese strategy was textbook Asian naval warfare. Burn what you can, board what survives, overwhelm through numbers. It had worked against pirates, rebels, and rival nations for centuries. It was about to meet European naval gunnery for the first time. De Mello let them come. Portuguese cannon crews tracked the approaching junks, but held fire. Every gunner knew that wasting ammunition at extreme range meant running out when it mattered most. The Chinese interpreted this silence as fear or incompetence. These foreign barbarians didn't even understand how to use their own weapons properly. The fire ships came within 300 yards. Still, the Portuguese guns remained silent. At 200 yards, Chinese crews began lighting the combustibles aboard their fire ships, preparing to ram the Portuguese vessels. At 150 yards, De Mello gave the order. Every Portuguese cannon fired simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic. 20 heavy bronze cannons discharging at once created a thunderclap that echoed across the bay and could be heard miles inland. The effect on the Chinese fleet was devastating beyond anything Ming commanders had anticipated. Here's what made European naval artillery so revolutionary compared to anything the Chinese had encountered. When Portuguese cannons fired, they weren't just making noise or creating morale effects. They were launching iron balls that could punch completely through wooden ships, sending splinters and fragments flying through packed crews. The first broadside struck the lead fire ships with catastrophic results. Solid iron balls, each weighing 12 to 24 pounds, smashed through junk hulls like they were paper. Ships designed to burn Portuguese vessels disintegrated before they could close to ramming distance. One fire ship took a direct hit to its combustible cargo and exploded in a fireball that engulfed two nearby war junks. Within minutes of the opening volley, the Chinese vanguard had lost a dozen ships without inflicting a single casualty on the Portuguese. But the Chinese fleet was massive. The loss of a dozen ships barely dented their numerical advantage. More war junks surged forward, their crews shocked by the destructive power of Portuguese guns, but too committed to turn back. Chinese commanders ordered their vessels to scatter, presenting multiple targets and forcing Portuguese gunners to choose priorities. It was sound tactical thinking except for one problem. Portuguese ships weren't operating independently. De Mello's formation meant that any junk approaching one Portuguese vessel came within range of multiple ships' cannons simultaneously. The Portuguese gun crews demonstrated the professional training that separated European naval forces from their Asian counterparts. These weren't soldiers who occasionally fired cannons when convenient. They were specialist gunners who'd spent years perfecting their craft. They could reload and fire every 2 to 3 minutes, maintaining a rate of sustained fire that Chinese observers found incomprehensible. Each cannon required a precisely coordinated dance of cleaning, loading powder, ramming the shot home, and aiming before firing. Portuguese crews executed these steps with mechanical efficiency, even as Chinese arrows began falling on their decks and fire lances sent jets of flame toward their ships. Here's where the difference in naval combat philosophies became most apparent. Chinese naval warfare emphasized the decisive moment when ships closed to boarding range and Marines could fight hand-to-hand. All Chinese tactics aimed to reach that moment where superior numbers would overwhelm the enemy. Portuguese naval warfare emphasized never letting enemies reach boarding range at all. Keep them at a distance where cannons were decisive and close quarters numbers meant nothing. For the next hour, Portuguese gunners systematically destroyed every Chinese junk that tried to close. War junks that approached from the front were met with devastating bow fire. Those attempting to flank were caught in crossfire from multiple Portuguese ships. The few that managed to get close enough for their crews to prepare boarding actions were blasted with grapeshot, essentially turning cannons into giant shotguns that swept Chinese decks clean of personnel. The Chinese fleet's morale began to crack. These weren't cowards or poorly trained sailors. They were professional naval forces who'd fought countless battles. But they'd never experienced anything like this systematic destruction from weapons they couldn't effectively counter. Chinese crossbows and fire lances had ranges measured in dozens of yards. Portuguese cannons could kill at hundreds of yards. By the time Chinese ships got close enough to use their weapons, they'd already been shot to pieces by multiple cannon strikes. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and one-sided. Around midday, the Chinese commanders tried a new approach. If direct assault wasn't working, they'd use their numerical superiority differently. They sent multiple waves of war junks simultaneously from different directions, trying to overwhelm Portuguese gun crews through sheer volume of targets. The theory was sound. Even the fastest gun crews couldn't reload fast enough to engage dozens of ships attacking simultaneously. Some junks would inevitably get through. The tactic partially worked. Several Chinese war junks managed to close to within a few ship lengths of Portuguese vessels, near enough that boarding seemed possible. Chinese Marines prepared grappling hooks and boarding pikes, ready for the close-quarters combat, where their numerical advantage would finally matter. But the Portuguese had prepared for exactly this scenario. As Chinese junks closed to point-blank range, Portuguese soldiers armed with arquebus opened fire. These early firearms were slow to load and relatively inaccurate compared to later muskets, but at close range against densely packed targets, they were devastating. Chinese Marines climbing onto their own railings to prepare boarding actions were shot down before they could throw their grappling hooks. The few junks that managed to get close enough to actually touch Portuguese ships found themselves facing organized resistance from professional soldiers who'd spent years fighting boarding actions across 3 oceans. Here's what the Chinese commanders hadn't anticipated about Portuguese crews. These men knew they were outnumbered 100 to 1. They knew that if Chinese Marines successfully boarded even one ship, they'd be overwhelmed through sheer numbers. That knowledge created desperate ferocity rather than panic. Portuguese soldiers fought like trapped wolves, using every weapon available. Swords, pikes, arquebus fired at point-blank range, even improvised weapons like belaying pins and boat hooks. They gave no ground because they had no ground to give. One step back meant Chinese Marines flooding aboard. The handful of junks that successfully grappled Portuguese vessels were systematically cleared of boarders within minutes, then pushed away by crews who immediately returned to supporting other ships with cannon fire. By early afternoon, the Chinese fleet was in disarray. They'd lost dozens of war junks sunk or so badly damaged they were taking on water. Hundreds of Marines were dead or wounded, and they'd failed to successfully board or capture even one Portuguese ship. Ming commanders faced a crisis of confidence. Every traditional tactic had failed. Fire ships had been destroyed before reaching targets. Direct assault had been slaughtered by cannon fire. Simultaneous attacks had been repelled by coordinated defense. The only option remaining was retreat or continuing to send men to die against weapons they couldn't counter. But here's what made retreat politically impossible. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a demonstration of Chinese authority intended to erase European presence from Asian waters. Retreating meant admitting that barbarian foreigners with a handful of ships could defy the Ming dynasty's navy. The political consequences of that admission were potentially more dangerous than continued military losses. The Chinese fleet reorganized for a final massive assault. Every remaining war junk, perhaps 80 or 90 vessels, would attack simultaneously from all directions. They'd accept horrific casualties, but surely sheer numbers would eventually overwhelm 6 Portuguese ships. It was the same calculation that military commanders throughout history have made when facing superior technology with superior numbers. We can't match their weapons, but we can outlast them. They have to run out of ammunition eventually. Portuguese gun crews watched the Chinese fleet gather for this final push with grim determination. They'd been fighting for hours. Cannons were so hot that gun crews had to drench them with seawater to prevent the bronze from warping. Ammunition was running low, not exhausted, but concerning. Men were exhausted from the physical labor of continuous gunnery in tropical heat. But they'd come too far to break now. The final Chinese assault came on like a tidal wave. dozens of war junks surging toward the Portuguese formation from every direction simultaneously. De Mello made one final tactical adjustment that would prove decisive. Instead of trying to engage all approaching ships equally, he ordered his vessels to concentrate fire on specific sectors, destroy enough junks in one approach direction to create a debris field that would slow other ships, force the Chinese fleet to navigate around their own wrecked vessels. The tactic worked brutally well. Portuguese cannons firing in concentrated volleys shattered entire groups of war junks before they could close. Wrecked ships, many still burning, created obstacles that disrupted Chinese formation. Junks trying to avoid debris collided with each other or lost momentum. The coordinated assault fragmented into separate local actions that Portuguese ships could defeat in detail. But some Chinese ships got through. 3 war junks, their crews showing extraordinary courage, managed to close with Portuguese vessels and throw grappling hooks. Chinese Marines swarmed across the railings in numbers that should have been overwhelming. For a few desperate minutes, the outcome hung in balance as Portuguese crews fought hand-to-hand combat on their own decks. The fighting on those Portuguese decks was savage and claustrophobic. Chinese Marines outnumbered the Portuguese defenders at least 3-1 on the ships they'd successfully boarded. They fought with swords, pikes, and the desperate courage of men who watched their comrades die by the hundreds trying to reach this moment. But the Portuguese had one final advantage that numbers couldn't overcome: discipline under pressure. While Chinese Marines surged aboard in an uncoordinated mass, Portuguese soldiers formed tight defensive lines. They used the confined space of ship decks to their advantage, creating choke points where Chinese numerical superiority couldn't deploy effectively. Soldiers in the front rank fought with swords and boarding pikes, while those behind reloaded arquebus and fired into the packed Chinese Marines at point-blank range. It was brutal, ugly work, but it was effective. Within 10 minutes, Portuguese crews had cleared their decks and cut the grappling lines holding Chinese junks alongside. The 3 war junks that had successfully reached Portuguese ships drifted away with most of their Marines dead or dying on enemy decks. It was the Chinese fleet's final throw of the dice, and it had failed. Chinese commanders watched their last coordinated assault disintegrate into burning wreckage and realized they had no moves left. They'd thrown everything at 6 Portuguese ships: fire ships, massed assaults, simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, desperate boarding actions. Nothing had worked. The barbarian foreigners still floated intact, while dozens of Chinese war junks littered the bay as sinking wrecks or burning hulls. The psychological breaking point came shortly after the failed boarding actions. Chinese crews who'd shown extraordinary courage for hours began refusing orders to attack, not through cowardice, but through simple rational calculation. Continuing to assault Portuguese ships meant certain death with no realistic chance of success. Officers who tried to force the issue faced near mutiny from men who watched too many comrades die to incomprehensible weapons. By mid-afternoon, the Chinese fleet began withdrawing, not in panicked flight, but in sullen, defeated retreat. War junks that were still seaworthy pulled back beyond Portuguese cannon range and began collecting survivors from damaged vessels. The Ming Navy that had approached Tamao that morning with absolute confidence in their numerical superiority limped away, having learned that numbers meant nothing against weapons that could kill from ranges where traditional naval forces couldn't respond. De Mello didn't pursue. His ships were battered, ammunition was critically low, and his crews were exhausted. More importantly, he'd achieved his objective. The Portuguese fleet had survived, maintained their trading position, and demonstrated that European naval forces couldn't be easily driven from Asian waters through brute force. But the victory came at a cost. Portuguese casualties were surprisingly light given the intensity of the fighting. Perhaps 50 men killed and another 100 wounded out of 600. Several ships had sustained damage from the few fire lances and boarding actions that got close. But all 6 vessels were still seaworthy and combat-capable. The Chinese casualties were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but Ming forces probably lost between 40 to 60 war junks sunk or damaged beyond repair. Casualties among Chinese crews and Marines likely exceeded 3,000 killed or wounded. The kill ratio was roughly 60-1. In 6 hours of naval combat, Portuguese ships had inflicted one of the most one-sided defeats in Asian naval history. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The psychological and political impact of Tamao would ripple across Asia for decades. Here's what made this battle so strategically significant. The Ming dynasty was the dominant power in East Asia, controlling the world's largest economy and most sophisticated bureaucracy. When they sent their navy to eliminate European presence in Chinese waters, they expected quick, decisive victory. Instead, they suffered humiliating defeat. That outcome sent shockwaves through Asian political and military circles. Within months, word of Tamao spread throughout maritime Asia. Portuguese ships with their terrifying cannons had defeated the Ming Navy. The implications were enormous and troubling for traditional Asian powers. If China's massive fleet couldn't overcome a handful of European ships, what hope did smaller kingdoms have? The battle accelerated a process that was already beginning across Asian waters. Local rulers started reassessing their relationship with these European newcomers. Instead of viewing Portuguese as minor irritants to be expelled when convenient, Asian powers began treating them as serious military threats requiring careful diplomatic handling. Some kingdoms decided that accommodating Portuguese trading interests was preferable to fighting them. Others began desperately seeking their own access to European cannons and gunpowder technology, hoping to match the weapons that had proven so devastatingly effective at Tamao. For the Ming dynasty specifically, Tamao was a profound humiliation that contributed to a policy shift regarding maritime affairs. Chinese officials had already been debating whether foreign trade was worth the complications it created. The Portuguese defeat of their navy strengthened the faction that argued for limiting foreign contact entirely. Over the following decades, Ming China would become increasingly isolationist, restricting foreign trade to designated ports under strict control. This policy, intended to protect Chinese sovereignty, would ultimately weaken China's position in Asian trade networks. While the Ming turned inward, Portuguese and other European powers expanded their trading networks throughout Southeast Asia, gradually establishing the commercial dominance that would characterize European-Asian relations for centuries. But here's where the long-term consequences become more complex. The Portuguese victory at Tamao demonstrated European technological superiority in naval warfare, but it also revealed European vulnerabilities. Portugal simply didn't have enough ships and men to control Asian waters through force alone. Their strategy required cooperation with local rulers, strategic trading posts rather than territorial conquest, and maintaining technological advantages that wouldn't last forever. The battle also established a pattern that would repeat throughout European expansion in Asia. European forces consistently won tactical victories through superior weapons and training. But those tactical victories didn't automatically translate to strategic dominance. Asian powers had vast populations, enormous resources, and centuries of sophisticated political traditions. They could absorb defeats that would destroy smaller nations and adapt to new military realities. Peter the Great's response to defeat at Narva, studying Swedish tactics and rebuilding his army, would be mirrored by Asian powers studying European technology after defeats like Tamao. The technological gap that seemed so decisive in 1521 would gradually narrow as Asian powers acquired cannons, trained gunners, and adapted their military systems. Within a generation, Asian fleets would be equipped with European-style artillery. Within a century, some Asian powers would be manufacturing their own cannons that rivaled European quality. For the Portuguese themselves, Tamao confirmed that their strategy of armed trading could work even in the face of opposition from major Asian powers. They established themselves permanently in Macau just a few years after the battle, creating a trading post that would remain under Portuguese control for over 400 years. From Macau, Portuguese merchants would dominate trade between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia for decades. The Great Ship trading route between Macau and Nagasaki would become one of history's most profitable trade routes, generating wealth that funded Portuguese expansion across the globe. The battle demonstrated several principles about military technology and warfare that would remain relevant for centuries. First, technological superiority can overcome vast numerical disadvantages, but only if that technology is employed by properly trained personnel. Portuguese cannons were devastating because Portuguese crews knew how to use them effectively. The same weapons in untrained hands would have been far less effective. Second, tactical victories don't guarantee strategic success. The Portuguese won decisively at Tamao, but couldn't leverage that victory to dominate China. They remained a peripheral presence tolerated when useful, restricted when troublesome. Military power creates opportunities but doesn't determine political outcomes. Third, innovation in military technology creates temporary advantages that competitors will eventually match. The Portuguese enjoyed perhaps 50 years where their naval gunnery gave them decisive advantages in Asian waters. But as Asian powers acquired similar weapons and training, that advantage eroded. Sustaining dominance requires continuous innovation, not just initial technological leads. The battle also revealed something about the nature of military professionalism versus numerical superiority. The Chinese fleet at Tamao was brave, well organized by contemporary standards, and massively larger than the Portuguese force. But Portuguese crews had spent years in continuous naval combat across multiple oceans. That experience created expertise that numbers couldn't match. Every Portuguese gunner had fired cannons hundreds of times. Every soldier had fought boarding actions in real combat. That professional competence was a force multiplier worth more than raw numbers. September 1st, 1521 marked the day that European naval dominance in Asian waters became undeniable. 6 Portuguese ships had faced the Ming dynasty's navy and won through superior technology, training, and tactics. The battle didn't make Portugal master of Asian seas, but it proved that European forces couldn't be easily expelled through conventional naval power. Asian rulers would spend the next century adapting to this new reality. Some would resist European presence and eventually acquire the technology to compete. Others would accommodate European traders and profit from the new commercial networks. But none could ignore the lesson of Tamao. The age when Asian powers could control their own waters without reference to European military capabilities had ended. The age of European maritime dominance had begun. For Martim Afonso de Melo and his 600 men, Tamao was the defining moment of their lives. They'd faced impossible odds and won through skill, courage, and the devastating effectiveness of European cannons. Most would continue their careers in Asian waters, some dying in later battles, others returning to Portugal wealthy from years of profitable trading. Their names are mostly forgotten today, but their achievement remains. They held their ground when outnumbered 100-1. They demonstrated that European naval technology had fundamentally changed the balance of maritime power. And they opened Asian waters to European trade in ways that would reshape global commerce for centuries. The Chinese fleet that limped away from Tamao carried more than just casualties. They carried the knowledge that the world had changed, that foreign barbarians possessed weapons that traditional naval forces couldn't effectively counter, and that the Ming dynasty's assumption of natural superiority over all other nations had just been challenged in the most dramatic way possible. Subscribe for more battles where technological innovation and professional training overcame overwhelming numerical odds and changed the course of global history.